Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 17, Smallpox, Women, Blacks, and Latinos in the Revolution. History is a passion to me. I love studying it. When I got started, I was not too fond of U.S. history, but another story for another time. But one of my all-time favorite passions is Star Wars. I love the stories, the world, the characters. Those in the Ryan Lancaster fan club know that every birthday I sit down and play a few rounds of Star Wars Battlefront on PlayStation 2. I remember the only time I ever skipped a class was freshman year to download and watch the Phantom Menace trailer on Apple. It took over an hour. So, anytime I can intersect with two passions, I will do that. A documentary about the Phantom Menace creator and director George Lucas speaks about the similarities between the prequel movies and the original films. He says, quote, "It's like poetry. It's sort of... they rhyme. Each stanza kind of rhymes with the last one. This is a sentiment that is true also about history itself. The lazy idiom is, history repeats itself, but that is not true. We will never have another Hitler because the person who was Hitler existed in his own time and tainted the vision of the future. Now, we definitely can, and sadly will, get another world leader that mimics or imitates Hitler. As historians, we use these events and people like cautionary tales and can almost predict the outcomes. History is virtually formulaic that way. Living through this pandemic has regrettably changed all of us. Some good, some bad. In March of 2020, when the nation began to panic as we slid into quarantine, I walked over to my bookshelf and grabbed a copy of Pax Americana by Elizabeth Fenn. The book chronicles the smallpox epidemic that swept the Americas during the 1770s. Why would I subject myself to that, you ask? I just wanted to see how this was all going to play out. Smallpox. After European explorers reached the West Coast in the 1770s, smallpox rapidly killed at least 30% of Northwest Coast Native Americans. For the next 80 to 100 years, smallpox and other diseases devastated native populations in the region. Smallpox is a dangerous disease caused by the variola major virus. The most common type of smallpox, ordinary, historically has devastated populations with a 30% death rate. The smallpox virus is transmittable through bodily fluids and materials contaminated with infected materials. Generally, face-to-face contact is required for an individual to contact smallpox because of an interaction with other humans. Unlike some viruses, humans are the only carriers of variola major. This limits the chances of the virus being unknowingly spread through contact with insects or other animal populations. Persons infected with smallpox are infectious to others for about 24 days of their infection time. However, there is a period in which individuals are contagious but have only begun to experience minor symptoms such as fever, headaches, body aches, and sometimes vomiting. This epidemic occurred during the years of the American Revolutionary War. There was no medical technology widely available to protect soldiers from outbreaks in crowded and unhygienic troop camps during this time. Thus, this virus posed a significant threat to the Continental Army's success, led by George Washington. It is not known where the outbreak began. Still, the epidemic was not limited to the colonies on the eastern seaboard, nor the areas ravaged by hostilities. The outbreak spread throughout the North American continent. In 1775, it was already raging through British-occupied Boston and among the Continental Army's invasion of Canada. During Washington's siege of Boston, the disease broke out among both Continental and British camps. Many escaped slaves who had fled to the British lines in the South likewise contracted smallpox and died. In the South, it reached Texas. From 1778 to 1779, New Orleans was especially hit hard due to its densely populated urban area. By 1779, the disease had spread to Mexico and would cause the death of tens of thousands. At its end, the epidemic had crossed the Great Plains, reaching as far west as the Pacific Coast, as far north as Alaska, and as far south as Mexico, infecting virtually every part of the continent. One of the worst tragedies of the pandemic was the massive toll of Americans' indigenous population. The disease was likely spread via the travels of the Shoshone Indian tribes. Beginning in 1780, it reached the pueblos of the territory comprising present-day New Mexico. It also showed up in the interior trading posts of the Hudson Bay Company in 1782. It affected nearly every tribe on the continent, including the northwestern coast. It is estimated to have killed almost 11,000 Native Americans in the western area of present-day Washington, reducing the population from 37,000 to 26,000 in just 7 years. Though there was not much known about viruses and their transition, English colonists in North America recognized the effectiveness of isolating individuals infected with smallpox. The English colonies were more aware of the features of smallpox than of almost any other infectious disease. It was widely recognized that there were only two options for protecting oneself against the disease: quarantine or inoculation against the disease. Many feared inoculations and instead chose isolation via quarantine. Individuals with recognized infections were sent to remote locations where they could let the illness run its course without the fear of infecting others. If needed, the scale of the quarantine could be increased. This meant cutting off entire towns from the rest of the colonies for the duration of the disease. Members of the English colonies and English officials were proactive in establishing quarantine guidelines to protect the public. One of the earliest recorded examples of this was a quarantine established in 1647 by Puritans to prevent the disease from ships coming from the Caribbean. In 1731, an act entitled "An Act to Prevent Persons from Concealing the Smallpox" was passed. This act made the head of households mandatory reporters for smallpox. These individuals were required to report smallpox in their house to the Massachusetts Bay Colony Selectmen. Infected families would then be indicated in the placement of a red flag. In South Carolina, sentinels were posted outside infected households, and infectious notices were required to be posted. In many colonies, islands were set up to quarantine individuals coming in by ship. This decreased the chances of smallpox being introduced via trade or travel. By the late 1700s, almost all colonies had quarantine laws in effect to diminish the hugely damaging impact that smallpox could have on their communities. Upon taking charge of the Continental Army, Washington recognized the severe danger that smallpox posed to his men and the war's outcome. To this end, Washington became particularly attentive to the least symptoms of smallpox among his men. Further, Washington was prepared to quarantine any members of his troops showing symptoms according to previous discovered methods of guidelines, including using a particular hospital. Following an outbreak of smallpox in Boston, Washington took further precautions to protect his men. He quarantined his men from the dangerous Boston public. These measures included the refusal to allow contact between the soldiers and the viral refugees of Boston. Additionally, the Continental Army's specific retreats can be linked to Washington's wish to avoid smallpox and his intense caution when it came to his troops. Though it was practiced in many parts of the world, the technology of inoculation, or variolation, was not known in Europe until the 1700s. It was widely publicized by Lady Mary Whately Montagu, who inoculated her children against smallpox, despite widespread concern and controversy. Inoculation was the practice of introducing infected materials into healthy individuals' bodies, hoping that they would contract a mild form of smallpox, recover, and be immune for further infections. The outcome of inoculations in surviving patients was successful. These individuals proved to be resistant to smallpox. Understandably, there was much concern surrounding the practice of inoculation. The ordinary person could not comprehend the efficacy of intentionally infecting an otherwise healthy person with a potentially fatal disease. Thus, many were reluctant to have themselves or their family members inoculated. There were instances in which these fears were validated. Many of those who had been inoculated died because of smallpox they had been exposed to. Additionally, there was the potential for an accidental outbreak of smallpox after contact between inoculation patients and the public. The choice of significant individuals such as John Adams and Abigail Adams to be inoculated did some to make inoculations more accepted, but there was still much progress to be made. George Washington contributed significantly to the progression of public health systems in America. During his time working with the Continental Army, Washington observed how smallpox and other diseases spread like wildfire through army camps and gatherings. This was often due to the cramped and dirty living conditions of these places. Washington understood the destructive nature of smallpox and other diseases such as malaria and scarlet fever. He was also one of the first to introduce the idea of compulsory health initiatives such as widespread inoculation. Washington also had experience with disease outside the realm of combat and war. Having himself suffered from many illnesses and observing those of his family, George Washington was an integral part of the establishment of the American public health programs. Along with quarantine, another one of Washington's methods for keeping men healthy was the use of inoculation. Like others of his time, Washington was not intimately familiar with the exact mechanism of the virus. However, he and others realized that men who had previously contracted and subsequently recovered from smallpox were unlikely to become ill a second time. Thus, early on, Washington recognized the strategic advantage of these individuals. During an outbreak in Boston, Washington sent troops made up of only men who had previously been infected with smallpox. With this, he was able to protect his soldiers and take advantage of Boston's vulnerability and its British inhabitants during the smallpox outbreak of March 1776. Initially, George Washington was reluctant to inoculate his troops, but he watched many of his men fall victim to smallpox. Washington believed that he would be able to keep his forces healthy through sanitary and quarantine methods. Several events contributed to the change of Washington's policy. First, Washington recognized that quarantine and attempted cleanliness was not enough to keep his vital troops healthy and in fighting form. Additionally, many prominent members of colonial society themselves had made their families be inoculated. Eventually, even George Washington's wife, Martha Washington, was herself inoculated. It was not long after this that Washington initiated the inoculation of the American troops. Washington recognized the dangers of inoculating these men. Many patients died due to the infection caused by inoculation. However, the importance of keeping his men healthy outweighed the risk, and almost all Continental soldiers were inoculated against smallpox. Washington, a survivor of smallpox himself, understood the danger that smallpox posed to his men, saying, quote, "Necessity not only authorizes but seems to require the measure, for should the disorder infect the army, we should have more to dread from it than from the sword of the enemy." End quote. However, it was more complicated than just Washington making this decision. Local officials were concerned that soldiers' inoculation would lead to the accidental spread of smallpox among civilians. But Washington persisted in his quest and managed to get most of his soldiers inoculated. Along with the rise in popularity of the practice, Washington's decision to inoculate his troops was also extremely strategic. He realized the profound impact of an epidemic would have on his forces. Immunity was initially more widespread among the British men than the Americans. This was due to the more accepted practice of inoculation in Europe and the high childhood cases, resulting in immunity. With this, an epidemic spread among Americans could prove disastrous to the American cause. With his men at Valley Forge inoculated, Washington proceeded with more confidence, knowing that at least his men would not be struck down by the smallpox virus. Many of the leading figures associated with the American Revolution were also involved in stopping the disastrous spread of smallpox throughout the American colonies and beyond. Such individuals included George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and among others. Before the party's steps, public health policies in the colonies were not well established. They were limited to emergencies. This is to say that policies and programs sprung up around epidemics and quarantines, wherever they were needed at the moment. However, the scourge of smallpox prompted changes to be made that would impact America's public health for years to come. At the time of its introduction, almost all colonists were too wary of this new medical procedure. It was difficult for them to understand how an otherwise healthy individual's infection could positively affect. However, inoculation saved many lives and may have protected the Continental Army from destruction. The smallpox inoculation program paved the way for the global public health system that is responsible for the control and eradication of many deadly diseases, including but not limited to polio, measles, and the like. Women in the Revolution. On November 16, 1776, Margaret Corbin fired her first husband's cannon after being killed. She was herself severely wounded in the battle. Her husband was one of some 600 American soldiers defending Fort Washington in northern Manhattan from 4,000 attacking Hessian troops under British command. Margaret, too nervous about letting her husband go into battle alone, decided she wanted to go with him. Since she was a nurse, she was allowed to accompany her husband as a nurse for the injured soldiers. It is said that Corbin was standing next to her husband when he fell during battle. Immediately, she took his post, and because she had watched her husband, a trained artilleryman, fire the cannon so much that she was able to fire, clean, and aim the cannon with great ease and speed. This impressed the other soldiers and was the beginning of her military career. She later became the first woman in the U.S. history to receive a pension from Congress for military service because she could no longer work due to injury. At the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778, Mary Hayes attended to soldiers by giving them water. Just before the battle started, she found a spring to serve as her supply, and 2 places on the battlefield were now marked as Molly Pitcher Spring. She spent much of the early days carrying water to soldiers and artillerymen, often under heavy fire from British troops. The weather was scorching, and her husband, William Hayes, collapsed during the battle, either wounded or suffering from heat exhaustion. It has been offered as a report that he was killed in the fight, but it is known that he survived. He was also carried off the battlefield. Mary took his place at the cannon and continued to swab and load the battery using her husband's ramrod. At one point, the British musket ball or cannonball flew between her leg and tore off the bottom of her skirt. She supposedly said something to the effect of, "Well, that could have been worse," and went back to loading the cannon. Later in the evening, the fighting was stopped due to the gathering darkness. Although George Washington and his commanders expected the battle to continue the following day, the British forces retreated during the night and continued to Sandy Hook, New Jersey. After the battle, General Washington asked about the woman he had seen loading a cannon on the battlefield. In commemoration of her courage, he issued Mary Hayes a warrant as a non-commissioned officer. Afterwards, she was known as Sergeant Molly, a nickname that she had used for the rest of her life. Her story morphed into Molly Pitcher legend. Deborah Sampson was the only woman historians know to have fought disguised as a man during the Revolutionary War. In early 1782, Sampson wore men's clothes and joined an army unit in Middleborough, Massachusetts under the name Timothy Thayer. She collected a bonus and then failed to meet up with her company as scheduled. Inquiries by the company's commander revealed that a resident had recognized Sampson when she signed her enlistment papers. Her deception uncovered, she repaid the portion of the bonus that she had not spent, but she was not subjected to further punishment by the army. The Baptist church to which she belonged learned of her actions and withdrew her fellowship, meaning that its members refused to associate with her unless she apologized and asked for forgiveness. In May 1782, Sampson enlisted again in Uxbridge, Massachusetts, under the name Robert Shirtliff. She joined the Light Infantry Company of the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. This unit, consisting of 50 to 60 men, was first quartered in Bellingham, Massachusetts, and later mustered at Worcester with the rest of the regiment commanded by Colonel William Shepard. Light infantry companies were elite troops, especially picked because they were taller and stronger than average. Their job was to provide rapid flank coverage for advancing regiments and rear guard and forward reconnaissance duties for units on the move. Because she joined an elite unit, Sampson's disguise was more likely to succeed since no one was likely to look for a woman among soldiers who were specifically chosen for their above-average size and superior physical ability. Sampson fought in several skirmishes. On July 3, 1782, outside of Tarrytown, New York, she took 2 musket balls in her thighs and sustained a cut on her forehead during the first battle. She begged her fellow soldiers to let her die and not take her to a doctor, out of fear she'd be discovered. But a soldier put her on a horse and took her to a hospital. The doctors treated her wound, but left the hospital before they attended to her leg. Fearful that her identity would be discovered, she removed one of the balls herself with a penknife and sewing needle, but another one was too deep for her to reach. Her leg never fully healed, and she carried one of the musket balls for the rest of her life. On April 1, 1783, she was reassigned to new duties and spent several months serving as a waiter to General John Patterson. The war was thought to be over following the Battle of Yorktown, but since there was no official peace treaty, the Continental Army remained in uniform. On June 24th, the President of Congress ordered George Washington to send a contingent of soldiers under Patterson to Philadelphia to help quell a rebellion of American soldiers who were protesting delays of their pay and discharges. During the summer of 1783, Sampson became ill in Philadelphia and was cared for by Dr. Barnabas Binney. He removed her clothes to treat her and discovered the cloth she had used to bind her breasts. Without revealing his discovery to army authorities, he took her to his house where his wife, daughters, and nurse took care of her. In September 1783, following the signs of the Treaty of Paris, November 3rd was set as a date for soldiers to muster out. When Dr. Binney asked Sampson to deliver a note to General Patterson, she correctly assumed that it would reveal her gender. In other cases, women who pretended to be men to serve in the army were reprimanded, but Patterson gave her a discharge, a note with some words of advice, and enough money to travel home. She was honorably discharged at West Point, New York, on October 25th, 1783, after a year and a half of service. On March 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John Adams, a leader in the Continental Congress, recommending, "In the code of law, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into their hands of the husbands." Her husband wrote back, "As your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems." The physical toll. During the Revolutionary War, more soldiers died from disease than from combat. Soldiers had a poor diet, worn-out clothes, damp shelters, and lived in unsanitary conditions. Diseases such as smallpox and typhus killed thousands of soldiers. Hospitals and medicine were not very good at this time in history. An injured soldier was often better off if he were left to heal by himself rather than being treated by a doctor. Following the Revolutionary War, service members who suffered significant injuries or were unable to provide for their household were financially supported by the first pension law enacted by the Continental Congress on August 26, 1776. the Continental Congress passed the first pension law under which half of the pay of life or during disability was extended to every officer, soldier, or sailor losing a limb in any engagement or being so disabled in the United States service as to render him incapable of earning a living. The resolution allowed for proportionate relief to those who were partially disabled from making a living. Without the power to raise money to fund the law, Congress was dependent on each state to execute it. After the war ended, provisions for benefits to veterans were established in 1789. Many of the first applications, however, were destroyed by fire in 1800 and again in 1814. A partial record of earlier pensioners does exist for 1792, 1794, and 1795 in reports to Congress. The Act of 1782, extending the provisions, found 1,500 invalid pensioners on the rolls. Half pay for life went to officers and widows of those officers. This began in 1780. Then, in 1788, Congress granted 7 years half pay to officers who served at the end of the war. 2,480 officers received communications certificates. However, delayed payments existed. The law of 1818 provided that every needy person who had served to the war's close would receive pensions for 9 months or longer. When the law was rewritten in 1820, many names were removed from the pension rolls because they were not indigent. In 1832, most of the benefits were stripped. By 1867, most pensioners on the rolls were dead, even though 2 names went on the rolls after that. The last old soldier to die was Daniel F. Bakeman, who died April 15, 1869 at 109 years. In 1869, there were 887 widows on the rolls. And believe it or not, in 1906, there was still 1 widow on the pension list. She was Esther S. Damon, who died November 11, 1906. Estimates are that 20,485 soldiers were granted pensions in 1818, 1,200 in 1828, and 33,425 in 1832. In 1789, the federal government assumed responsibility for the state's invalid pensions for soldiers on the Continental Line. Latinos in the Revolution. One important Latino figure during this time was Governor and General Bernardo de Galvez. Born in Spain and Latino governor of the Louisiana Territory during the American Revolution, he was a significant factor in assisting General George Washington in fighting British soldiers who were advancing into the United States' southwestern part. Galvez helped by blockading British ships, although Spain did not officially declare war against Britain. Governor de Galvez also provided weapons and food to the Continental Army between 1775 and 1777. When Spain formally declared war with Great Britain in 1779, de Galvez organized a militia of Native Americans, freed African Americans, and his soldiers to attack the British-held forts at Baton Rouge and in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Natchez, Mississippi. Within a couple of years, he also was able to liberate Mobile, Alabama, and Pensacola, Florida. The governor also played a vital role in assisting Americans with the capture of Yorktown, Virginia. With Cuba's help, he obtained supplies for French Admiral Joseph Paul de Grasse, who then sailed up the Chesapeake Bay and assisted Washington in victory. Another patriot, George Farragut, born in Spain in 1755, was a lieutenant in the American Revolution for the South Carolina Navy. He fought the British in the Battle of Savannah, but was captured in Charleston siege in 1780. He was released in a prisoner exchange and later fought in the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina and another fighting in Wilmington, North Carolina. As part of the North Carolina's cavalry in Cowpens, he saved the life of his commander, Lieutenant William Washington, in hand-to-hand combat with Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton. Farragut's army was able to block Tarleton's militia from retreating in 1781. While fighting for his adopted country, he never forgot his birthplace of Spain. Born in Caracas, Venezuela, Francisco de Miranda became part of the Spanish army at 22. He was involved in the American Revolution in 1781, participating in the siege of Fort Pensacola. Miranda was awarded the temporary title of lieutenant colonel during the campaign. As a mentor under General de Galvez, Miranda fought in Pensacola, contributed to Washington's victory in Yorktown, and was a part of the Spanish capture of the Bahamas. Another aspect that cannot be overlooked is that Cuba was a major financial contributor in equipping thousands of General Washington's troops. Cuba's first Creole Captain General and Governor of La Habana helped organize a massive fundraising campaign with Cuba's elite. The 1.2 million pounds sterling Washington received would today be the equivalent of $28 million. With this assistance, Washington was able to focus on the eastern front of the war. At the same time, Galvez sent weapons, medicine, and uniforms up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, then across Pennsylvania. George Washington invited Galvez to march alongside him in the Victory Parade of July 4th, 1783. The Continental Congress also recognized Galvez's accomplishments. African Americans in the Revolution. Thousands of enslaved African Americans in the South escaped to British lines as they were promised freedom to fight with the British. In South Carolina, 25,000 enslaved African Americans, 1/4 of those held, escaped to the British or otherwise leave their plantations. After the war, many African Americans are evacuated with the British for England. More than 3,000 black loyalists are transported with other loyalists to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, where they are granted land. Still, others go to Jamaica and the West Indies. An estimated 8,000 to 10,000 were evacuated from the colonies in these years as free people. About 50% of those slaves who defected to the British and about 80% of those who survived, many free blacks in the North fight with the colonists for the rebellion. The significant role African Americans played in the War for Independence cannot be disputed. African Americans served with distinction for the American cause, from Lexington and Concord's opening engagement to Yorktown's climactic siege 8 years later. Many also served in the American Navy or on board numerous American privateers. Crispus Attucks, a Bostonian employed in the maritime industries, was one of the first Americans of any race to die for freedom, as one of the 5 victims of the Boston Massacre in late 1770. Historians continue to debate whether more African Americans served the British than the Americans, but what is clear is that the pivotal driving force behind participation was the promise of freedom or that of a better life. It is crucial to understand that at the time of the War for Independence, slavery was practiced in all 13 colonies. As the public opinion in the colonies moved towards independence, Congress organized the Continental Army. States were expected to supply troops for the new army, and the regiments were organized and designated by states after independence was declared in 1776. Almost immediately, they questioned whether free blacks living in the states could join the Continental Army. In the early phase of the war, they could not, but as fighting continued and men were needed in the ranks, things began to change. In some cases, free blacks who enlisted served side by side with white patriots in the same unit, and the armies created segregated units later on. In July 1775, George Washington, a Virginian and slave owner, assumed command of the early Continental Army encamped outside of Boston. Like most slave owners, Washington feared guns in blacks' hands, particularly those enslaved, believing that armed slaves might foment a rebellion. Slave owners also feared that by placing enslaved persons in the army, they would be in an expectation that they would be freed based on their service. Therefore, he expressly prohibited bringing blacks into the army's ranks initially. Yet serving by Washington's side faithfully throughout the war was William Lee, his manservant, who accompanied Washington into battle. In November 1775, however, Virginia's British Royal Governor, Lord Dunmore, proclaimed that he would free any slave who left his master to serve alongside British forces. Within a month, 300 had joined what Dunmore had dubbed his Ethiopian Regiment. The act terrified patriot slaveholders. Congress and Washington decided to reverse themselves in response, permitting enlisted free blacks to remain in the Army, and recruitment of free blacks opened up. Eventually, Washington's initial skepticism about allowing African Americans into the Continental Army ranks turned to admiration as he saw black men fighting for the same cause he did, along with their white counterparts. Perhaps this appreciation for black contributions to the war effort led to his eventual decision to free his slaves upon his death, becoming the most prominent founder to do so. The most famous mixed-race fighting unit on the patrol Patriot side was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, organized in 1778, though their role was limited to the war's northern theater. Washington endorsed the organization of this regiment. Enlisting in the company were 88 slaves who were guaranteed freedom at the end of their service. The Rhode Island State Assembly promised compensation to their former masters. In some instances, enslaved African Americans served in partisan bands like those organized in the South Carolina by Francis Marion, better known as the Swamp Fox. Far fewer black men ultimately did in the South than in the North because of the harsher prevailing racial sentiments. Even still, there were black soldiers, including the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, operating the American siege lines at Yorktown as Washington brought up a vice grip around General Lord Cornwallis, ending the war's significant military actions. He helped dig the parallel American siege lines and were engaged in combat when the British attempted a sortie against the American position. The results of the War of Independence were mixed with African Americans. Many northern states outlawed slavery after the war, with Vermont being the first new state to join the Union whose state constitution prohibited it. In some northern states, free African Americans who lived there were even granted the franchise for a limited time. This does not mean that African Americans possessed full equality, however. While northern states abolished slavery, black people still could not officially serve in the military. For southern loyalists who held slaves, they were evacuated after the war. They took their slaves with them, particularly those who chose to resettle in the British colonies in the Caribbean. Interestingly, the French nobleman who ardently served the American cause, the Marquis de Lafayette, was the most vocal critic in Washington's army about slavery and the lack of black soldiers used to serve their cause. After the war, Lafayette personally attended to James Armistead's manumission, who had been under his command during the siege of Yorktown. Armistead changed his last name to Lafayette upon receiving his freedom and happily greeted his former commander when in 1824 a 67-year-old Lafayette made his triumphal return to the United States. When Lafayette visited New Orleans on his tour, he greeted African-American Revolutionary War veterans who had migrated there. Lafayette was troubled by the founding generation's failure to confront the great paradox of a people dedicated to freedom, holding others in bondage. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.